Hello there, fellow explorers of history's darkest corners. Tonight, we're going to uncover one of the most shocking and brutal stories in all of human civilization. A tale of bodyguards who became kingmakers, protectors who became predators, and an elite military unit that transformed from Rome's greatest strength into its most dangerous weakness. So please, settle yourself comfortably wherever you are tonight. Perhaps dim the lights and pull your blanket a little closer. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in Edinburgh as winter winds whistle through the streets? Perhaps from a quiet apartment in Toronto as snow begins to fall? Maybe you're in a small town in California, watching the evening fog roll in from the coast? Wherever you are, you're about to discover that the men sworn to protect Rome's emperors with their lives became the empire's most prolific imperial assassins, turning the sacred trust between ruler and guardian into a blood-soaked marketplace where emperors were bought and sold like commodities. If this exploration into the ultimate betrayal of duty and honor helps you appreciate the fragility of power and the corruption that comes with unchecked authority, perhaps consider subscribing for more journeys through history's most shocking betrayals. And don't forget to like this video if it helps you drift into peaceful sleep. Think your workplace has trust issues? Think modern politics is corrupt? Imagine working for a security force where murdering your boss was considered a legitimate career advancement strategy, where loyalty was measured in gold coins rather than years of service, and where the people tasked with protecting the most powerful man in the world regularly held auctions to sell his position to the highest bidder. Imagine living in an empire where the emperor's own bodyguards were more dangerous to him than any foreign enemy, where taking the throne meant immediately planning how to survive your own protectors, and where the average imperial reign lasted less than 5 years because the Praetorian Guard had turned regicide into a thriving business model. This is the horrifying reality of the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit that was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of Roman discipline and loyalty, but instead became a cancer that ate the empire from within, transforming the office of emperor from a position of ultimate power into what amounted to a death sentence with better accommodations. Picture, if you will, the Roman Empire at its zenith around 100 CE, when Roman legions controlled territory stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to the Euphrates River in the east. This vast empire, encompassing over 2 million square miles and governing perhaps 60 million people, represented the greatest concentration of power and wealth in human history. Roman engineering had built roads that connected distant provinces with precision that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Roman law provided a framework for justice that influenced legal systems across 3 continents. Roman culture produced literature, art, and architecture that still inspires wonder today. At the heart of this magnificent empire sat the emperor, a figure who wielded more absolute power than any human being before or since. The emperor commanded legions that could reshape the map of the known world, controlled treasuries that could fund massive public works projects, and held the power of life and death over millions of subjects. Yet this seemingly omnipotent ruler lived in constant fear of the men who were supposed to protect him, because those men had discovered that killing emperors was far more profitable than serving them faithfully. The Praetorian Guard was established by Augustus, the first Roman emperor, around 27 BCE as an elite military unit tasked with protecting the imperial family and maintaining order in the capital. Augustus understood that ruling an empire required not just political skill but also physical security, particularly in a city like Rome where political violence had become commonplace during the final years of the Republic. The Praetorians were meant to be the ultimate expression of Roman military virtue. Disciplined, loyal, and incorruptible soldiers who would serve as the emperor's personal shield against assassination and rebellion. But from the very beginning, the Praetorian Guard contained within it the seeds of its own corruption and the empire's eventual destruction. By creating an elite military force stationed in the capital, answerable only to the emperor himself, Augustus had inadvertently created a monster that would eventually devour the very institution it was meant to protect. The Praetorians were given privileges and pay scales that far exceeded those of regular legionaries, creating a sense of entitlement and special status that would eventually metastasize into the belief that they had the right to determine who ruled the empire. The early decades of the Praetorian Guard's existence seemed to justify Augustus's confidence in the institution. Under the first few emperors, the Guard performed its duties with professional competence, protecting the imperial family while maintaining a relatively low profile in Roman politics. The Praetorians were well-trained, well-equipped, and apparently loyal to the concept of imperial authority, even if their personal feelings about individual emperors might vary. But this apparent stability masked growing problems within the Guard's ranks, problems that reflected deeper issues with the nature of imperial power itself. The Praetorians were essentially mercenaries with privileged access to the most powerful man in the world, and it was inevitable that some among them would begin to wonder why they should serve an emperor rather than simply becoming the power behind the throne. The transition from protector to kingmaker required only a small shift in perspective, but the consequences of that shift would prove catastrophic for the empire. The first major crisis involving the Praetorian Guard occurred in 41 CE. During the reign of Caligula, an emperor whose increasing paranoia and erratic behavior had made him enemies throughout Roman society. Caligula's 4-year reign had been marked by spectacular cruelty, financial irresponsibility, and behavior that many Romans considered clear evidence of madness. He had declared himself a god, engaged in sexual relationships with his sisters, and implemented policies that seemed designed to humiliate the Roman elite while bankrupting the imperial treasury. But what made Caligula particularly dangerous to the Praetorian Guard was his apparent belief that emperor worship should be taken literally. He demanded that the Praetorians treat him not just as their commanding officer but as a divine being whose every whim deserved absolute obedience. This created an impossible situation for the Guard, whose members were expected to maintain military discipline while also participating in what amounted to religious theater that many of them found deeply disturbing. The assassination plot that ended Caligula's reign was organized by Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune who had endured years of personal humiliation at the emperor's hands. Chaerea was a veteran soldier whose distinguished military record should have earned him respect, but Caligula delighted in mocking the tribune's advanced age and questioning his masculinity in front of other officers. The emperor's behavior toward Chaerea was not just personally offensive but professionally destructive, undermining the tribune's authority and making it impossible for him to maintain discipline among his subordinates. The conspiracy that Chaerea organized involved multiple members of the Praetorian Guard, along with senators and other palace officials who had their own reasons for wanting Caligula dead. The plot was carefully planned and expertly executed, demonstrating that the Praetorians possessed not just the access and weapons necessary to kill an emperor, but also the organizational skills needed to coordinate a complex assassination involving multiple participants with different motivations. On January 24, 41 CE, the conspirators struck while Caligula was attending theatrical performances at the Palatine Games. As the emperor left the theater through a narrow underground passage, Chaerea and his fellow conspirators surrounded him and stabbed him to death with dozens of wounds. The assassination was swift and brutal, but what happened next was even more revealing about the Guard's evolving relationship with imperial power. Rather than simply announcing Caligula's death and allowing the Senate to determine the succession, the Praetorian Guard took it upon themselves to choose the next emperor. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace and proclaimed him emperor on the spot, effectively bypassing all constitutional procedures and establishing the precedent that the Guard had the right to make and unmake emperors according to their own preferences. Claudius, terrified and unprepared for imperial responsibilities, immediately agreed to pay the Praetorians a substantial bonus for their support, establishing another dangerous precedent that would come to define the relationship between emperors and their supposed protectors. The message was clear. Imperial power could be bought and sold, and the Praetorian Guard was open for business. The transformation of the Praetorian Guard from protectors to kingmakers accelerated dramatically over the following decades. Each successive emperor found himself in the impossible position of trying to maintain the loyalty of men who had already demonstrated their willingness to murder their previous employer. The result was an escalating cycle of bribery, paranoia, and violence that consumed increasing amounts of imperial resources, while making the emperor's position less secure with each passing year. Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, exemplified the toxic relationship that had developed between emperors and their guards. Nero came to power as a teenager through the machinations of his mother Agrippina, who had arranged for his adoption by her husband Claudius and then quite possibly poisoned Claudius to clear the way for her son's succession. From the beginning, Nero's reign was characterized by suspicion of everyone around him, including the Praetorians who were supposed to protect him. Nero's paranoia was not entirely irrational, given that several plots against his life were discovered during his 14-year reign, some of which involved members of the Praetorian Guard. The emperor responded to these threats by increasing the guard's pay and privileges, while simultaneously expanding his network of spies and informants within their ranks. The result was a poisonous atmosphere of mutual suspicion, where both emperor and guards viewed each other as potential threats rather than as partners in maintaining imperial security. The most significant challenge to Nero's reign came in 65 CE with the discovery of the Praetorian conspiracy, a plot organized by Gaius Calpurnius Piso that involved senators, knights, and critically, several high-ranking Praetorian officers. The conspiracy was betrayed before it could be executed, but its scope revealed just how deeply opposition to Nero had penetrated even into the ranks of his personal bodyguards. The emperor's response was characteristically brutal, involving the execution or forced suicide of dozens of suspects, including some of Rome's most distinguished citizens. But Nero's survival of the Praetorian conspiracy only delayed his eventual downfall. By 68 CE, revolts had broken out in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, while the Praetorian Guard's loyalty had been fatally undermined by years of mutual suspicion and competing bribes from potential usurpers. When the Guard finally withdrew their support from Nero, the emperor found himself completely isolated, with no military force willing to defend him against the advancing armies of his rivals. Nero's suicide in June 68 CE marked the beginning of the Year of the Four Emperors, a period of civil war that demonstrated just how completely the Praetorian Guard had abandoned any pretense of loyalty to imperial institutions in favor of naked opportunism. Over the course of 12 months, the Guard successively supported Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, changing sides whenever it became clear that their current choice was likely to lose the ongoing power struggle. The reign of Galba, who ruled for only 7 months, illustrated the impossible position that emperors now faced in dealing with the Praetorian Guard. Galba was a distinguished senator and military commander who should have been able to command respect from the Guard, but he made the fatal error of trying to reform the institution by reducing their privileges and imposing stricter discipline. The Praetorians' response was swift and decisive. They murdered Galba in the Roman Forum and immediately proclaimed Otho as the new emperor. Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he was defeated by Vitellius in a civil war that devastated much of northern Italy. Vitellius himself survived only 8 months before being overthrown by Vespasian, whose victory finally restored some stability to the empire, but only after demonstrating that the Praetorian Guard's loyalty could be purchased by whoever offered the highest bid. The Flavian dynasty, established by Vespasian and continued by his sons Titus and Domitian, managed to maintain control of the Praetorian Guard for several decades through a combination of generous payments, careful personnel management, and the establishment of alternative military forces that could serve as a counterweight to the Guard's power. But even the Flavians could not solve the fundamental problem created by having an elite military unit stationed in the capital with both the means and the motivation to interfere in imperial politics. Domitian's 15-year reign, which lasted from 81 to 96 CE, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of imperial attempts to control the Praetorian Guard. Domitian was a capable administrator and military commander who understood the importance of maintaining the Guard's loyalty, but his increasingly autocratic behavior and paranoid suspicion of potential rivals created exactly the kind of atmosphere that encouraged conspiratorial thinking among his supposed protectors. The conspiracy that ended Domitian's life in 96 CE was organized by court officials and senators, but it could never have succeeded without the cooperation of Praetorian officers who controlled access to the emperor and possessed the military skills necessary to carry out the assassination. The plot was carefully planned and expertly executed, with the conspirators using their knowledge of Domitian's daily routine and security procedures to gain access to his private quarters and kill him before his loyal guards could intervene. The assassination of Domitian marked the beginning of what historians call the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, a period of relative stability that lasted for nearly a century but was built on the shaky foundation of constantly negotiated relationships between emperors and their increasingly mercenary protectors. Each emperor in this period managed to maintain Praetorian loyalty through different combinations of payments, privileges, and careful personnel management, but none was able to solve the underlying structural problems that made the Guard a permanent threat to imperial security. The reign of Commodus, which lasted from 180 to 192 CE, revealed just how completely the emperor-guard relationship had been corrupted by mutual suspicion and financial considerations. Commodus was the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, but he showed little interest in the serious business of governing an empire, preferring to spend his time participating in gladiatorial games and other entertainments that scandalized the Roman elite. Commodus's neglect of imperial responsibilities created opportunities for various court officials and military commanders to accumulate power and influence, often by bribing Praetorian officers to support their particular faction or policy preference. The result was a situation where the Guard's loyalty was constantly being auctioned to the highest bidder, with different groups of officers supporting different potential successors, depending on who offered the most attractive financial incentives. The conspiracy that ended Commodus's life on December 31st, 192 CE, was organized by court officials who had concluded that the emperor's erratic behavior posed a threat to their own survival. The plot involved Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Laetus, who controlled the day-to-day operations of the Guard and was able to ensure that loyal guards would not interfere with the assassination. Commodus was strangled in his bath by an athlete named Narcissus, but the killing could never have occurred without the active cooperation of the very men who were supposed to protect the emperor's life. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's assassination revealed the full extent to which the Praetorian Guard had abandoned any pretense of serving imperial institutions in favor of pursuing their own financial interests. Rather than allowing the Senate to choose a successor or supporting the legitimate heir, the Guard decided to auction the imperial office to the highest bidder in what amounted to a grotesque parody of a legitimate political process. The auction took place at the Praetorian camp, with potential emperors literally bidding against each other for the support of the guards who controlled access to imperial power. The winner was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who offered to pay each Praetorian 25,000 sestertii, an enormous sum that represented several years' salary for an ordinary Roman citizen. Julianus paid the bribe and was proclaimed emperor, but his reign lasted only 66 days before he was overthrown by Septimius Severus, whose superior military forces rendered the Praetorians' support irrelevant. The year of the five emperors, as 193 CE came to be known, marked the absolute nadir of imperial-Praetorian relations and demonstrated that the Guard had become not just corrupt but actively destructive to the stability of the empire. Over the course of 12 months, the Praetorians supported Pertinax, who was assassinated after 3 months, Didius Julianus, who was executed after 66 days, and finally submitted to Septimius Severus, who disbanded the existing Guard and replaced them with his own loyal troops from the Danubian legions. Severus's solution to the Praetorian problem was characteristically brutal and effective. He ordered the existing guards to appear before him unarmed, then surrounded them with his own troops and dismissed them from service with ignominy. The new Praetorian Guard that Severus created was recruited from his most loyal legions and was initially more reliable than its predecessor, but the fundamental structural problems that made an elite Guard unit dangerous to imperial stability remained unresolved. The Severan dynasty managed to maintain control of the reformed Praetorian Guard for several decades, but by the mid-3rd century CE, the old patterns of corruption and disloyalty had reasserted themselves with a vengeance. The period from 235 to 284 CE, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, saw the empire nearly collapse under the pressure of constant civil wars, many of which were triggered or facilitated by Praetorian betrayals of the emperors they were supposed to protect. During this 50-year period, the empire had over 50 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths, often at the hands of their own guards or with their guards' complicity. The Praetorian Guard had become so notorious for murdering emperors that the position itself was widely viewed as a death sentence, making it difficult to find qualified candidates willing to accept the risks that came with imperial power. The assassination of Emperor Aurelian in 275 CE exemplified the casual brutality with which the Praetorian Guard now treated imperial authority. Aurelian was one of the most successful military commanders of his era, a man who had restored Roman control over vast territories and defeated numerous foreign enemies. But his attempts to impose discipline on the Praetorian Guard and reduce their privileges made him enemies among the very men who were supposed to protect him. The conspiracy against Aurelian was organized by Praetorian prefect Mucapor, who forged documents suggesting that the emperor planned to execute several high-ranking officers. The forged evidence convinced a group of Praetorian officers that their lives were in immediate danger, and they responded by ambushing and killing Aurelian while he was traveling between cities. The assassination was based entirely on fabricated evidence, but the conspirators' willingness to believe the worst about their emperor revealed just how completely trust had broken down between rulers and their supposed protectors. The murder of Aurelian demonstrated that even successful and popular emperors were not safe from Praetorian violence if they attempted to reform or discipline the guard. The institution had become so powerful and so accustomed to operating without meaningful oversight that any attempt to impose imperial authority was viewed as an intolerable threat to their privileges and independence. The crisis of the 3rd century finally ended with the accession of Diocletian in 284 CE, but Diocletian's solution to the Praetorian problem involved fundamentally restructuring the imperial system in ways that acknowledged the impossibility of maintaining effective central control while allowing an elite military unit to operate independently in the capital. Diocletian divided the empire into eastern and western halves, created a system of multiple emperors, and relocated the imperial court away from Rome, effectively reducing the Praetorian Guard's political influence by removing them from day-to-day contact with imperial decision-making. But even Diocletian's reforms could not completely solve the problems created by 3 centuries of Praetorian corruption and violence. The Guard continued to exist and continued to interfere in imperial politics, though their influence was somewhat reduced by the new institutional arrangements. The final solution to the Praetorian problem would not come until 312 CE, when Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and used his victory to disband the Praetorian Guard permanently. Constantine's decision to eliminate the Praetorian Guard was both practical and symbolic. Practically, he understood that no emperor could feel secure while an institution with such a long history of regicide continued to exist. Symbolically, the disbandment of the Guard represented a clean break with the imperial traditions that had made Roman politics so violent and unstable for so many centuries. The members of the disbanded Praetorian Guard were scattered throughout the empire, with some being reassigned to frontier garrisons and others simply discharged from military service. Their barracks in Rome were demolished, their privileges were revoked, and their institutional memory was deliberately suppressed in an effort to prevent any revival of the organization that had caused so much chaos and bloodshed. But the damage that the Praetorian Guard had inflicted on the Roman Empire over 3.5 centuries of existence could not be undone simply by disbanding the institution. The Guard's legacy of violence, corruption, and institutional betrayal had fundamentally altered the nature of imperial power, transforming the emperor from a position of secure authority into what amounted to a target for anyone ambitious enough to organize a conspiracy and ruthless enough to commit murder. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of assassination had profound effects on imperial decision-making throughout the period of Praetorian ascendancy. Emperors who should have been focusing on the long-term challenges facing the empire instead spent much of their time and energy on short-term survival strategies designed to maintain the loyalty of men who had repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to kill for money. The financial cost of maintaining Praetorian loyalty was equally devastating to imperial resources. The constant need to pay increasingly large bonuses to prevent assassination attempts drained the imperial treasury of funds that could have been used for public works, military campaigns, or economic development. The empire found itself trapped in an escalating cycle of bribery that consumed ever larger portions of imperial revenue while providing ever-diminishing returns in terms of actual security. The institutional damage caused by the Praetorian Guard extended far beyond their direct violence against individual emperors. Their example of successful insubordination encouraged similar behavior among other military units throughout the empire, creating a culture of military indiscipline that made it increasingly difficult to maintain effective command and control over the legions. Provincial governors and military commanders learned from the Praetorian example that loyalty was negotiable and that superior officers could be challenged or even eliminated if the price was right. The political precedents established by the Praetorian Guard also had lasting effects on the development of imperial institutions. The Guard's assumption of the right to choose emperors undermined constitutional procedures and established the principle that military force rather than legal authority determined political legitimacy. This precedent would continue to influence Roman politics long after the Guard's disbandment, contributing to the empire's eventual fragmentation and collapse. The social impact of Praetorian violence was equally profound, as the constant threat of imperial assassination created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that affected all levels of Roman society. Citizens never knew whether their current emperor would survive long enough to complete major projects or honor important commitments, making long-term planning difficult and undermining confidence in imperial institutions. The moral damage inflicted by the Praetorian Guard may have been the most serious of all, as their example of institutionalized betrayal corroded the ethical foundations upon which effective government depends. The Guard's transformation from protectors to predators demonstrated that even the most sacred bonds of loyalty and duty could be corrupted by greed and ambition, a lesson that encouraged cynicism and opportunism throughout Roman society. The international implications of Praetorian violence were also significant, as foreign enemies learned that they could often achieve more through bribery and assassination than through military conquest. The empire's neighbors understood that Roman emperors were vulnerable to internal threats and adjusted their diplomatic and military strategies accordingly, sometimes achieving major concessions simply by exploiting imperial instability. The technological and military innovations that might have strengthened the empire were often neglected or abandoned because emperors under constant threat of assassination lacked the time and security necessary for long-term strategic planning. The empire's military capabilities stagnated and eventually declined as resources were diverted from legitimate defense needs to the impossible task of purchasing the loyalty of inherently disloyal guards. The legal and administrative reforms that could have improved imperial governance were similarly neglected as emperors focused on immediate survival rather than systematic improvement of imperial institutions. The empire's legal system remained inefficient and corrupt. Its administrative procedures became increasingly bureaucratic and expensive, and its taxation system grew ever more burdensome as the cost of maintaining imperial security consumed an increasing share of public resources. The cultural and intellectual achievements that had once made Rome the envy of the ancient world also suffered under the pressure of constant political instability. Artists, writers, and scholars found it difficult to secure patronage or complete major projects when their potential sponsors were liable to be murdered at any moment. The empire's cultural life became increasingly sterile and derivative as creative individuals focused on safe, conventional projects rather than the innovative work that required long-term support and stable conditions. As you settle into sleep tonight, reflect on how the institution created to protect Rome's greatest asset, its emperors, became the primary threat to that very asset. Consider how the corruption of a single military unit ultimately contributed to the fall of the greatest empire in human history, demonstrating that internal betrayal can be far more destructive than external enemies. Think about how the Praetorian Guard's transformation from protectors to predators illustrates the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of any single institution, no matter how trustworthy it may initially appear. Let their story remind you that loyalty cannot be purchased indefinitely, that power without accountability inevitably becomes corrupted, and that the guardians of authority may pose a greater threat to that authority than any external enemy. The lessons of the Praetorian Guard remain relevant today, warning us about the dangers of allowing security forces to operate without effective oversight and reminding us that those we trust to protect our institutions may ultimately be the ones who destroy them. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the age of emperors and their treacherous bodyguards has passed into history, but remember that the human capacities for loyalty and betrayal, for honor and corruption, remain constant across the centuries. The ghosts of the Praetorian Guard march eternal through the corridors of power, serving as a permanent reminder that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that even the most trusted protectors can become the most dangerous enemies when their loyalty is measured in gold rather than honor.